And I'm very grateful that Britta Frede jumped in with her paper on Whose Islam. You see the title here on the screen. Yeah, and this is also how to say the signal to introduce. Britta Frede is our first presenter this morning. She has been a postdoctoral researcher in Islamic studies at the University of Bayreuth since 2020 and is a member of the Excellence Cluster Africa Multiple, funded by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. She also serves as postdoc representative in the academic committee of this cluster. Britta did accomplish her PhD in Islamic Studies at the Free University of Berlin in 2012 with a dissertation on the renewal of the Tijaniya in Mauritania, popularization of religious ideas in the colonial period, which was published in 2014 and that received the Hedwig Hinze Frauenförderpreis, an award for promoting women academics. Britta has held several postdoctoral positions, mainly at the Berlin Graduate School Muslim Cultures and Societies and the Berlin Leibniz Center for Modern Oriental Studies, the ZMO, Zentrum Moderner Orient. Britta was furthermore associated with a funding initiative of the Volkswagen Foundation, Africa Knowledge for Tomorrow, postdoctoral fellowships in the humanities in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. She was the German postdoc partner of Dr. Halkano Abdiwario, who you see on the podium as well, from 2013 to 2016 and 2017 to 2020. Her research interests are translocal relations and global interconnections of Muslim Africa in South-South perspective since 1800, Mauritanian manuscript culture, Islamic education and popular movements, especially Sufism and the Muslim Brotherhood, and finally, gender spheres in Islamic authority, female Muslim scholars and learning circles in Africa. Geographically, she focused on North Africa, especially the Maghreb and, well, the northwest part, Mauritania, and East Africa, especially Kenya. She has published numerous articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, and she contributed to relevant encyclopedic work, such as the Palgrave Handbook of Islam in Africa and the Encyclopedia of Islam edited by Brill in Leiden. Further details would largely exceed my time limit here, but please have therefore a look on Britta's well-documented homepage at the University of Bayreuth's website, so you might discover more of her work. So with this, I hand over to Britta. Please come to the podium. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Reinwald, very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. I would have loved to listen to Maron's presentation, but it's a pleasure to jump in her place and present a little bit of my work that is based on a work that has been done and is already published last year or before last year. It was published, but it was on a panel together with Abdullahi Sunay and Judith Scheder that we, as researchers of this Western Saharan Sahel region, thought of we have to think about terrorism and what to do with the recent developments during the last decade. Today I'm going to look at the same material in a little bit of different framework, not so much looking about Islamic heritage, but looking about the framework of violence that is inherited in the social inequality of Mauritania. But before I want to start with a famous satirist who wrote a gloss in a German newspaper titled the risk of death from ballpoint pens increases with wealth. Harald Martenstein on an underestimated threat. He wrote this gloss in 2010 at the height of terrorist threat in Germany. So I quote, it starts the following. The past few weeks have largely been dominated by terrorism. Whenever I turned on the TV, I saw the Minister of Interior talking about terrorist attacks with a straight face. He said, the best thing to do is remain calm. Rest, very important. But if one should above all remain calm, why are worried people sitting in the television studio all the time? Thankfully, nothing happened as of the editorial deadline for this column. In the meantime, scientists who have calculated the risk of terrorism have spoken out. The statistical risk of dying from a terrorist bomb in a Western country is less than the risk of suffocating when, or better after, swallowing a pen particle. It has been proven that 300 people choke on a ballpoint pen particle every year. This is 4 times as many as are struck by lightning. You also have to take into account that in many parts of the world, I'm talking about the poor parts, for example, the Sahel, there are very few pens. The risk of death from ballpoint pen increases with prosperity, and countries like Germany are at the focus. End quote. And the whole story continues a bit in the same direction until he concludes, and I quote again, you think that's black humor, irony? They are real dead, bottom line. They are just as dead as any other dead person. Undoubtedly, the number of victims of terrorism would be significantly higher and would significantly exceed the number of victims of ballpoint pens if there were no state fight against terrorism. I'm not making fun of sensible anti-terrorist measures, I just find our perception of risk strange. As safety-focused as our society is, pupils should be instructed early on about the correct use of ballpoint pens, end quote. After some more jokes about talk shows and reasoning that nobody would be convinced about the danger of a ballpoint pen, it all ends with the advice to remain calm for both threats, the pen and a terrorist attack. What Martenstein, with his satirist perspective, describes in his gloss emphasizes the fact that terrorism itself kills comparatively few people, but it unfolds its effects more in the fear of being killed in an attack than the real possibility of that. The main effect of terrorism is not the killing. It is the potential killing that creates an atmosphere of threat and violence that has a strong effect on social tensions and potential conflict, as many studies have already illustrated. However, in my paper today, I'm not talking about Europe or Germany, but we will shift now to Mauritania, a country in the Saharan desert bordering to the Sahel zone. Mauritania is a member of the G5 Sahel collaboration. Mauritania is celebrated for their effectiveness in having put terrorism in their own country under control since 2011, despite of the whole region's increase of insecurity at the same period. Nevertheless, Mauritania's post-independent history is shaped by many political struggles. One of the more recent concerns the overcoming of authoritarian rule by the military. Since its independence in 1960, the country has witnessed a number of coups d'etat. A coup in 1978 ended 17 years of presidential rule and put Mauritania under military rule until 1992, when the country's first multi-party elections were held. However, the introduction of a multi-party system in the country did not lead to substantial political change, especially as the military elite maintained its grip on political control in the country. Examples include President Ould Taya remaining in power until his removal in August 2005. A military council that oversaw a transition to democratic rule took over for another 2 years. And in April 2007, a first democratically elected government under President Sidi Mohamed Ould Sheikh Abdullahi was inaugurated. However, after 16 months in power, the president was overthrown again by a military coup led by General Mohammed Abdel Aziz. One of the justifications was old Sheikh Abdullahi's alleged incapacity to maintain security in the country. Old Abdelaziz was elected president in July 2009 and directly declared that he would focus on concerted counter-terrorism measures. He remained in power until August 2019, when the president Mohamed Ould Ghazouani, again a former general, won the elections with an absolute majority. Both generals, Ould Abdelaziz and Ould Ghazouani, were implicated in both previous coups d'etat. They present a faction of old networks of the military regime that is mainly committed to the reintegration of the country into international politics after Mauritania's isolation due to its support of Saddam Hussein during the US military intervention in Iraq in 2003. The political turbulence of the last decades were accompanied by a number of violent attacks, allegedly attributed to the GSPC, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, and after 2005 to their successor organization, AQI, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Between 2005 and 2011, various smaller attacks were carried out on the Mauritanian territory. These include clashes with the army, hostage-taking, and the killing of Western foreigners and attempts to attack symbolic public places, in particular the French embassy, whose compound also includes the French Cultural Center and the French school. There have been no attacks attributed to terrorism since 2011, but the threat of terror looms large. The sudden discontinuity and lull in terrorist attacks has, on the one hand, created rumors about a secret agreement between the regime of Abdelaziz and Al-Qaeda, and on the other hand, allowed the regime to celebrate its successes and its efficient counter-terrorism strategies. Human rights organizations protest that this strategy contained arbitrary arrest without due processes of young suspects from poor social classes. They further reported that the confessions of the detainees were often obtained through torture and other forms of coercion. In 2018, the head of the DSI, the Direction de la Sûreté d'État, Sidi Ould Baba Al-Hassan, praised the success of Mauritania's counter-terrorism strategies in a public interview. He emphasized that the success was due to the combination of military and security measures, as well as ideological, religious, legislative, and socio-economic ones. According to him, this strategy has, after nearly 10 years of implementation, led to positive results. The control of Mauritania's vast desert borders, securing the territory and population, the dismantling of all sleeping cells, arresting 650 suspects, and their prosecution before courts of law, the reintegration of repentant terrorists, and the curbing of further attacks on national territory since 2011. A month after this interview, the Mauritanian general, Hanena Ould Sidi, took over the head of the G5 security force. The G5 is a regional multilateral organization established in 2014, consisting of Mali, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, working together with the support of international donors with the aim of improving governance, infrastructure, agriculture, youth employment, and above all, security in the Sahel region. However, coming back to the gloss of Martenstein at the beginning, his intervention proves as well in the Mauritanian case terribly true. If we list all victims of terrorist attacks in Mauritania, we can hardly count 30 dead people in 6 years. Clashes with the army continued, of course, due to anti-terrorist campaigns at the border region to Mali, but all in all, the possibility to die in a terrorist attack in Mauritania is not very real. Not even one person dies within the last decade, as there was no more attack on the territory of Mauritania. However, the anti-terror campaigns are very dominant in political discourses, especially when it comes to education and punitive law, and the issue of youth. For the Mauritanian population, the terrorist threat unfolded in the society only after 2009, when a fictionary documentary has been screened talking about the danger of losing your own son to jihadist groups by recruiting them through channels of Islamic education. The film is called The Disappeared Friend, Mon Ami Disparu, by Zine El Abidine Old Mohammed, and was screened at Nouakchott Film Festival in 2009. The film is an Arabic-French fictional short film, is watchable on YouTube, that is made in a documentary style and tells the story of a young student who has gone abroad to study and after some time returns and sets out to find his friends from his neighborhood because he had lost his traces. Asking other friends and the mother of his friend what happened, the story develops as follows. The friend became interested in religious studies. After a while, he approached his friend with some books about Wahhabi doctrine and tried to convince them to join the group he's going to. From one day to the next, he left his friends and family and told them that he was going to study in an Islamic educational center out in the desert. He comes back once briefly for a visit, but seems to have changed his personality completely. Shortly after his return, he leaves again for his study and disappears without traces. The film ends with a suicide attack on the French embassy in Nouakchott, implicating that the young man of the film had been the one who conducted the attack. The main message of the film is that the international phenomenon of jihadism spared no one. It is not only the violence conducted by strangers, and that was the narrative before when the attacks happened, that had arrived in the capital. No, it is the homegrown youth that never traveled abroad that was recruited by a global terrorist organization. What the plot of this film debunks is that at this point, Mauritania faced the same problems as Muslim communities did elsewhere. Young people from ordinary families and neighborhoods were being recruited by jihadist organizations. Families and friends were left behind in a state of shock and grief, asking themselves what they could have done differently to avoid their son, daughter, or friend to disappear. The film had marked a turning point in the public perception of the threats of terror in Mauritania, and what had been largely perceived as a foreign problem before was now brought into the midst of society. An atmosphere of insecurity and threat established and remains to a certain extent until today, even though no more terror attack happened on the Mauritanian grounds. However, the loss of youth to jihadist groups in Mali is still a real threat. I have not seen any statistics, but I realized during my last field research in March this year, many families can tell you stories about a nephew or a cousin who has been attracted to earn a quick money and ends up as a shahid, a martyr of the jihad in northern Mali. If Islam and violence is debated, mostly people talk about jihad and terrorism. In my presentation today, I want to talk about aspects of violence beyond the jihad. I will not talk about jihadist groups and their discourses about legitimizing what they do or about how these groups can be silenced with a more or less effective anti-terrorist campaign. The problem we are faced with in all of this mess that we find in parts of Muslim Africa is that we are dealing with problematic terms that are not necessarily helpful to understand the complexity of processes. Further, I want to argue that the focus on jihadist terrorism, when reflecting about the ongoing violence in the regions, make us blind for analyzing the complexity and multi-layered processes of generating violent action in which many actors are involved. A serious problem from my point of view is the lack of definition when it comes to the terms we are using here. What is terrorism? Obviously, terrorism is a question of standpoint and deals with issues of legitimacy of physical violence for aiming at a political goal. What is freedom fight for the one side is a terrorist act for the other side, and looking at anti-terror laws in most of these countries, the lack of definition of what terrorism might be is inscribed in all of these laws and enables the ruling regimes to use these laws for silencing all kind of opponents of the ruling government. However, I think it does not make sense to look at incidences of violence separately if they all refer to the same framework. I want to argue here that we do not only witness an era of terror threats in the region, we are faced with something that I want to call Islamicate violence. Jihadist attacks are just one aspect of this Islamicate violence, and jihadist groups are only one actor within the whole mess. Islamicate violence is enacted by many players, the government, the economic and religious elites, and finally, by various social activists and not to forget Western donor organizations, as they increasingly co-opt with religious leaders to reach their goals and by financing a specific side within the religious field and struggle of whose vision of Islam is authentic and truth. They take side and become a player in the field of Islamicate violence that is going on in the whole region. They are often expressions of tensions resulting from access to resources, be it land or access to the state resources, be it access to the job market, just simply access to European economies. The Islamicate political discourse is embedded with a proper standpoint of post-colonial politicians. It is referring to a non-Western, a non-colonial route, and legitimizes political action by referring to the own cultural belonging. One could, of course, tackle most of the issues at play with references to human rights, but human rights discourses are perceived as Western discourses, and this is not very well appreciated by the majority of political actors and the populace. So, what I mean with Islamicate violence is a phenomenon of structural violence that is justified, neglected, and counteracted by arguments derived from the Islamic scriptural heritage. This heritage includes the Quran, Hadith, doctrinal texts, but foremost, in the case of Mauritania, Maliki Sunni Islamic law. It feels like a vicious circle of which to escape might be the de-Islamization of political discourse. Nevertheless, Islam is not the problem here. It is the pulling of Islam into the political discourse, the reasoning of arguments along lines that are declared as Islam and at the same time as rooted in local traditions, an African Islam or a real Islam, depending on who is speaking. We could now enter into the details of this religious conflict about whose version of Islamic interpretation is more authentic, but I want to call here for a change of perspective, and this is what I want to reach with the use of the term Islamicate violence. The term shall serve us to shade away from an exceptionalist, exotic approach toward Islamicate ideological and cultural phenomena. They are not exceptional, they are just framing common phenomena in an Islamic narrative, but once we dismantle the narrative, we find underlying quite common phenomena of violence that can be analyzed within the frame of social science. The common phenomena we are talking about here are various kinds of structural violence based on social inequality. Many of these structural violences result in physical violence. For example, when in the early 1980s, the regime in power introduced criminal law based on Sharia, the only victims of this newly implemented legislation were people belonging to the marginalized social strata of society. They lost their hands physically because of stealing. Only shortly after the implementation for this Islamic law in criminal law, the so-called physical punishments have been stopped again. In the Mauritanian context, many of the kind of social inequality we can report of are not very exceptional, but can be found in many regions of this world. Two examples I will briefly present here, and this concerns the so-called slave question and the blacksmith question. We could continue here with the women question, the LGBT question, the non-Muslim question, the race question, and so on and so forth. All these issues are issues of structural violence. They are not always fueled by religious arguments, but during the last decade, religious argument in social conflict dominate. To understand the struggle for equality of the abolition movement and the blacksmith movement in Mauritania, one needs to briefly introduce the social stratification of Mauritania's Arabo-Berber society. The main line of inequality goes along social status groups with a lineage system and the dependent status groups without lineage. The elite belongs to a lineage, but can be sorted to a warrior or an Islamic scholarly status. Part of the Islamic scholars co-opt with the colonial regime, but all benefited from the colonial power regime, and their status group took over power in post-independent Mauritania. They dominate the economic and political arena of the country. The warriors lost their influence during colonial times and had to go through many political and economic struggles since then. However, their struggle is not as difficult as the struggle of non-lineage status groups. The slaves or former slaves, known as Haratin, and the blacksmiths are belonging to this inferior social strata, and despite of the few well-known exceptions that have been lifted into administrative or political posts, they are deprived of access to the economic and political business of the country. The abolition movement in Mauritania is going back to the early independent period in 1962. In this movement, we can see a clear shift from a human rights movement to an Islamic-hate abolition movement. Massoud, who was made a career during colonial time, was the first activist who started fighting against slavery and for the emancipation of the former slaves in Mauritania. Massoud in his fights against slavery was influenced by the inequality problems in the United States and South Africa. In 1978, he created the secret organization Al-Hor, which means Organization for the Emancipation of Haratin. The creation of this organization contributes a lot for the Haratins in Mauritania because it quickly generated a numerous fellowship. The organization was protecting the right of the Haratins by creating a small unit of agents in the organizations who would stop the trade and mistreating of the Haratins by the Arabo-Berber elites. The mistreating of Haratins includes physical violence. Beating by the master families was very common. Rape for female Haratin a regular experience. Al-Hor created a revolution in the country, which leads in 1981 to an abolition of slavery law in Mauritania. However, slavery, as it is embedded within the lineage social order and inherited, has not been abolished. Further, mainstream Islamic scholars argue that slavery is legitimate according to Islamic tradition. The violence taking place in the context of slavery is therefore clearly an Islamic-hate violence because it is defined with references to Islamic law. Till today, Mauritania is one of the famous countries that still has a slave problem. Al-Hor did not remain the only abolition organization others joined in, and in 2007, again, a new anti-slavery law was released, but still slavery remains a problem. In 2008, the Initiative for the Resurgence of the Abolition Movement, the IRA, is an anti-slavery group in Mauritania headed by Biram Dar Abeid. According to their claim, Mauritania is estimated to have between 140,000 to 600,000 slaves today, of an overall population of only 4.5 million people. The group is described by Abeid as an organization of popular struggle. The group has been involved in sit-ins in front of the Justice Ministry, hunger strikes and marches through cities and towns around Mauritania. The main target of the group is the fight against the religious justification of slavery. While Al-Hor framed its emancipatory fight as a human rights movement inspired by secular examples of United States and South Africa, the IRA framed it as an Islamic battle. It argues that the Islamic interpretation that comes to the conclusion that slavery is legitimate is a wrong understanding of the Islamic message. It is important to note that one of the problems for the fighting slavery in Mauritania are contradicting legal codes. In 1981 and 2007, secular law, which forbids slavery, and the Constitution of 1992, which places Islamic law above secular law, allows slavery. So we can see that the ruling government is involved in the Islamic hate violence by preventing national law to enact its effectiveness and responding to Islamic law as the last reference that is not allowed